Brian Entin went inside, not to Nancy Guthrie's home, not to the crime scene, not to the spot in the Catalina foothills where blood was found on a front doorstep on the morning of February 1st, 2026. He went to the suspect's home. And what Brian Entin found inside the property connected to the person investigators have been examining in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance.
On the morning of February 1st, 2026, something was found on the front doorstep of a home in the Catalina foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. It was blood. Not a scene of chaos, not a home torn apart, not the kind of evidence that immediately tells you the whole story. Just blood, a missing woman, and a doorbell camera that had been physically removed from the wall in the middle of the night by a masked, gloved figure carrying a firearm. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, was gone. And in the weeks and months that followed, the question of who took her and how and why would become one of the most closely watched investigations in the country. But this video is not about the blood on the doorstep. It is not about the pacemaker monitor that missed its transmission at 2:28 in the morning, the digital timestamp that confirmed Nancy was no longer where she was supposed to be. It is not even about the unprotected crime scene that sat open and accessible in the early hours of the investigation, a failure that would later cost the Pima County Sheriff's Department its credibility and its relationship with the FBI. This video is about what happened when investigative journalist Brian Entin walked up to a specific property in Tucson, Arizona, and documented what law enforcement found inside. What he reported to a national audience on News Nation is the kind of detail that changes the way you see everything else in this case. And once you understand the full picture, the timeline, the relationships, and the evidence that was removed from that property, you will not look at this investigation the same way again. First, you need to understand who Brian Entin is, because his presence in this story is not incidental. Brian Entin does not cover cases from a studio desk. He does not wait for press releases or official statements before reporting. Since February 1st, 2026, he has been in Tucson, on the ground, knocking on doors, standing outside properties, and watching what investigators do in real time. He was outside Nancy Guthrie's home in those first critical days when the crime scene was still accessible to anyone who walked up to it. He was the journalist who said plainly and publicly, early in this investigation, that something had gone wrong at the institutional level, not just at the evidence level, that the failures surrounding this case were not only forensic, but structural. When he said those things, most other reporters were not yet willing to go there. Brian Entin went there on day 4. So when Brian Entin describes something as disturbing, that word does not come lightly. This is a journalist who has spent years covering violent crime, missing persons cases, and federal investigations. He has stood outside crime scenes that most people would not approach. He has reported on cases with details that are genuinely difficult to hear. When he uses the word disturbing to describe what he witnessed at the property investigators searched in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, you should understand exactly how much weight that word is carrying. Now, before we get to what was inside that property, you need to understand the basics of what happened to Nancy Guthrie, because many people have heard pieces of this story, but not all of it in the right order. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, living in her home in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson. She was not someone who wandered. She was not someone who forgot where she was or lost track of time. According to her family, she sometimes had difficulty with basic mobility. Walking to her mailbox on an ordinary day could be a physical challenge for her. She was a woman who was settled into her home, her routines, and her life. She was a mother and a grandmother. She was the kind of person who should have been completely safe in her own home on the night of January 31st, 2026. She was not. At approximately 9:50 in the evening on January 31st, Nancy Guthrie arrived home. She had been out, and she was dropped off at her Tucson residence. That moment, 9:50 p.m., is the last confirmed interaction between Nancy Guthrie and any known person before her disappearance. Less than 4 hours later, at 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, a masked figure wearing gloves and carrying a firearm appeared at Nancy Guthrie's front doorstep. The first thing that figure did was remove the doorbell camera from the wall. Not disable it remotely. Remove it physically. Then they went inside. At 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker monitor beside Nancy Guthrie's bed missed its scheduled transmission. She was gone. The Pima County Sheriff's Department responded. The FBI was eventually brought in. But in the critical early days of the investigation, the crime scene was not properly secured. Anyone, including a television camera crew, could walk up to that property and document what should have been under the strictest possible investigative control. That failure, which Brian Entin reported on from the scene in real time, would later result in Sheriff Chris Nanos facing questions under oath, a recall effort launched by county residents and calls for his resignation from county supervisors. On April 21, 2026, Nanos was questioned under oath again. The relationship between local law enforcement and the FBI had broken down almost completely before it was grudgingly repaired. But by the time investigators had corrected course, by the time the FBI had taken full control of the evidence and the direction of the investigation, something important had already happened. A name had emerged, a name that sat at the very center of this investigation, a name connected to a property that Brian Entin would later watch investigators search, a name connected to items that were removed from inside a home in Tucson under circumstances that Brian Entin described to a national audience as deeply and profoundly disturbing. That name is Tommaso Cioni. And who he is in relation to Nancy Guthrie is where this story truly begins. Tommaso Cioni is not a stranger to the Guthrie family. He is not a neighbor, not a passing acquaintance, not someone who crossed paths with Nancy Guthrie by chance. Tommaso Cioni is Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law. He is married to Annie Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and the sister of Savannah Guthrie, the nationally recognized television journalist who has been at the center of the public effort to find her mother. One of the people who loves Nancy Guthrie most in this world is married to the man whose name sits at the heart of this federal investigation. And Tommaso Cioni was the last known person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. That fact alone reframes everything. He was the person who dropped Nancy off at her Tucson home at 9:50 p.m. on January 31st, 2026. He was with her that evening. He stood at that property. He knew the address, the layout, the entry points. He had been inside that house before, many times, as a member of the family. He knew about the Google Nest doorbell camera mounted at the front of the home. He knew about the wireless security system. He had walked through those rooms, passed through those doors, and been present in that house in the way that only a family member is present, with ease, with familiarity, with no reason to think twice about any of it. And then, 3 hours and 57 minutes after he dropped Nancy off and drove away, a masked figure wearing gloves and carrying a firearm appeared at her front doorstep and removed that doorbell camera from the wall. Investigators have examined that window of time, those 3 hours and 57 minutes between 9:50 p.m. and 1:47 a.m. in extraordinary detail. It is enough time to drive somewhere and return. It is enough time to change clothes, gather specific materials, and plan a careful final approach to a property you already know intimately. It is a timeline that the FBI has not overlooked, and it is a timeline that places Tommaso Cioni's last known presence at Nancy's home uncomfortably close to the moment everything changed. When law enforcement activity began around the property connected to Tommaso Cioni, Brian Entin was already there. He watched. He documented. He reported in real time what investigators were doing at that property, what areas of the home received the most intensive examination, what the pattern of their search looked like, and what was removed. And critically, Brian Entin was not watching just one property that day. He documented coordinated law enforcement activity at 3 connected locations simultaneously: Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills, the property connected to Tommaso Cioni, and the home of Savannah Guthrie's sister. 3 locations, all active at the same time, all with visible investigative presence. That kind of coordinated multi-location operation does not happen during a routine follow-up visit. It happens when investigators have reached a point in their analysis where physical spaces need to be re-examined in light of new evidence. It happens when law enforcement has specific intelligence about what they are looking for and where they expect to find it. And at the property connected to Tommaso Cioni, according to Brian Entin's reporting, they found it. Items were removed deliberately and with purpose, in a way that indicated this was not a cursory search. It was targeted, it was specific. And what those items pointed toward, according to the investigative picture that has emerged through News Nation and other credible outlets, was a person with direct connection to what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the morning of February 1st. Now, consider the signal jammer. During the investigation, a theory developed that the person who entered Nancy Guthrie's home may have used a signal jamming device, equipment specifically designed to block wireless communications, to neutralize the doorbell camera's ability to transmit live footage and disable the security alerts that should have been sending notifications the moment anything went wrong. Signal jammers are not impulse purchases. They are not something a person picks up casually. They require research, deliberate procurement, and a specific reason to need one. A person acquires a signal jammer because they already know that a wireless security system exists at the location they are planning to enter. Who knew Nancy Guthrie had a wireless security system? Who knew the camera was mounted at the front door? Who knew the layout of that home well enough to understand exactly which systems would need to be neutralized and from which direction the approach would need to be made? A son-in-law who had been in that house dozens of times, who had stood at that front door, who had dropped her off there just hours before, already knew all of that without ever needing to look it up. Except that someone did look it up. Investigators identified that image searches were conducted specifically for Nancy Guthrie's home address in the Catalina foothills neighborhood in March of 2025, and again between November 30th and December 1st of 2025. Someone searched publicly available sources for photographs of the exterior of that property. Twice. 10 months before Nancy disappeared, and again 60 days before. The FBI subpoenaed Google for the IP address data connected to those searches, the device, the account, the complete digital trail. That data is now in the FBI's hands. Here is what Dr. Ann Burgess, one of the original architects of behavioral analysis at the FBI and a key inspiration behind the Netflix series Mindhunter, observed when she examined the evidence in this case alongside Brian Entin. She noted immediately that the absence of forced entry was not a minor detail. It was the central detail. No broken windows, no pried doors, no signs of struggle at the entry point. Someone got inside Nancy Guthrie's home without forcing their way in, which means one of a very limited number of possibilities. Someone Nancy trusted. Someone with access. Or someone who entered while she was away and waited. Dr. Burgess also addressed the ransom notes, which were sent not only to the family and to law enforcement, but to national media outlets and broadcast networks. Savannah Guthrie stated publicly that she believed at least some of the notes were legitimate. Dr. Burgess's analysis was direct. The notes were not the work of a stranger guessing at a family's dynamics. They were targeted and psychologically precise, designed to apply maximum pressure on the specific people most likely to respond. They reflected intimate knowledge of how this family operates, what they value, and what would hurt them most. Her conclusion was striking. She suggested the Bitcoin ransom angle may have been staging, a deliberate misdirection designed to send the investigation toward a financial motive, while the real motive was something else entirely. That real motive, according to Dr. Burgess, was revenge. Not the kind that erupts quickly and fades. The kind that is patient. The kind that grows quietly over years, sometimes over a decade or more, becoming more focused and more deliberate with time until it surfaces not as rage, but as control. She has documented cases where individuals carried a grudge for 10 years or longer before acting on it. And when they finally did act, the crime did not look impulsive. It looked methodical, because it was. She also raised the possibility of multiple offenders. Physically removing an 84-year-old woman from her home, controlling her, transporting her without anyone noticing, requires coordination. It requires timing. And in Dr. Burgess's experience, when more than one person is involved, there is almost always a weak link. Someone who feels the weight more than the others. Someone whose fear of being blamed outweighs their loyalty to staying silent. Someone who eventually makes the calculation that speaking is safer than waiting. She was clear on this point. It is not a question of whether that person breaks. It is only a question of when. The FBI behavioral profile, built from every piece of evidence generated in this investigation, describes someone with specific prior knowledge of the target and her property, above average, intelligence, the capacity for sustained long-term planning, and an intimate understanding of the target family's psychology. Someone whose movement through the home on the night of February 1st reflected the confidence of a person who had been there before. Someone who had staged the rear doors before the abduction itself. That profile, when placed alongside what investigators found inside the property connected to Tommaso Cioni, does not point toward a stranger. It points toward someone who was already inside this family's life, long before that night. After 86 days, here is where this investigation actually stands, with complete honesty about what is confirmed and what is still being processed. Because this audience deserves accuracy over drama. The DNA collected from inside Nancy Guthrie's home has been transferred to the FBI laboratory at Quantico, Virginia. It is currently being run through probabilistic genotyping software, a process that allows analysts to separate and identify individual DNA contributors from mixed samples, the kind of complicated biological evidence that is common in homes where multiple family members have legitimate reasons to have been present. Once that separation is complete, the samples will be compared against the CODIS National Criminal Database and prepared for the genetic genealogy pipeline, the same investigative method that cracked the Golden State Killer case after decades of dead ends. If a direct criminal database match does not emerge, genetic genealogy can work outward through family trees to identify contributors who have never submitted a DNA sample themselves. That process takes time, it is methodical, but it has resolved cases that once seemed completely unsolvable. Simultaneously, the FBI's cell site analysis team, known as CAST, is assembling the complete digital footprint of every phone active in the Catalina foothills area on the night of January 31st and into the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026. Cell tower data does not lie about location. It maps where a device was, how long it stayed, and when it moved. That data includes the footprint of every person who was in or near that neighborhood during the critical window of time between 9:50 p.m., when Tommaso Cioni dropped Nancy Guthrie off at her home, and 2:28 a.m., when her pacemaker monitor missed its transmission and confirmed she was gone. Every phone, every signal, every movement. The FBI is mapping all of it. The Google subpoena results are also in federal hands. The IP address records connected to those image searches of Nancy Guthrie's home address, conducted in March of 2025, and again, between November 30th and December 1st of 2025 have been turned over to investigators. That means the FBI now knows which device conducted those searches, which account was attached to that device, and the complete digital trail connecting those search sessions to a specific person. That information has been folded into the broader evidence package alongside the items removed from the property connected to Tommaso Chioni during the coordinated 3-location search that Brian Entin documented and reported on in real time. It is also worth being clear about what happened with the local investigation, because the institutional failures in this case are not a small footnote. They are a significant part of why this investigation took as long as it did to gain real traction. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos blocked FBI access to key evidence and to the Quantico laboratory pipeline for approximately 10 weeks after Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. 10 weeks during which DNA samples that should have been in federal hands were not. 10 weeks during which the full investigative resources of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, its digital forensics teams, and its evidence processing infrastructure were not being applied to this case the way they should have been from day one. When that obstruction became publicly known, the response was swift. County supervisors called for Sheriff Nanos to resign. A formal recall effort was launched. And on April 21, 2026, Nanos was questioned under oath for a second time. The dynamic between local law enforcement and federal investigators has fundamentally shifted since then. The FBI is no longer asking for cooperation. The evidence is at Quantico. The searches are being conducted. The data is being analyzed. The coordination that should have existed from the first morning is finally, grudgingly, in place. Now consider the psychological dimension of where this case stands, because Dr. Ann Burgess was very deliberate about this point when she spoke with Brian Entin. She has spent decades studying how people carry secrets, and she is clear that no one carries a secret this heavy indefinitely, especially when that secret is shared with another person. She explained that when multiple people are involved in a crime, the psychological weight is distributed, but so is the risk. Each person involved becomes a potential point of failure. Each one is aware that the other could decide at any moment that self-preservation matters more than loyalty. That awareness does not stay quiet. It grows louder over time. It breeds paranoia. It creates the kind of low-level, constant fear that causes people to make small errors, a comment that does not quite fit, a reaction that is slightly too strong, a detail mentioned that they should not have known. Those small errors are exactly what investigators look for in cases like this, because solving a crime of this nature is rarely about finding one dramatic piece of evidence. It is about connecting smaller ones, and those smaller pieces very often come from people, not from crime scenes. For the family of Nancy Guthrie, none of this investigative progress changes the daily reality of not knowing. Savannah Guthrie has committed $1 million of her own money toward finding her mother. That is not a gesture. That is a mother's daughter refusing to accept that the people responsible will simply walk away. The family has not given up. They are cooperating with investigators. They are speaking publicly. They are doing everything within their power to keep Nancy Guthrie's name in front of the people who have the authority to bring her home. And Nancy herself is not an abstraction in this story. She is a real woman, 84 years old, someone who sometimes struggled to walk to her own mailbox on an ordinary afternoon. She is a mother and a grandmother who was taken from the place she should have been safest, in her own bed, in her own home, in a neighborhood she had lived in and trusted. She did not wander. She did not leave on her own. She was taken by someone who planned it carefully, who prepared for it deliberately, and who has been living with that knowledge every single day since February 1st, 2026. Dr. Burgess believes this case will be solved, not because she is offering comfort, but because she has watched human behavior under pressure for her entire career. And she knows what sustained investigative attention does to people carrying secrets. The longer a case remains active, the harder silence becomes to maintain. With DNA at Quantico, cell tower data being mapped, Google IP records in federal hands, items from the suspect's property being processed, and a behavioral profile specific enough to narrow the field. Significantly, the walls around whoever is responsible are not standing still. They are closing. Brian Entin has not left this story. He was there on day 4 when nobody else was willing to say what was wrong. He was there when investigators searched that property and removed what was inside. He will be there when this case breaks, and this case will break, because the evidence is building, the pressure is mounting, and somewhere in Tucson tonight, an 84-year-old woman's family is still waiting for someone to bring her home. Now I want to hear from you. Investigators have the Google search data, the DNA, the cell tower records, and the items removed from the suspect's property. Given everything you have just heard, what do you think those image searches conducted 10 months before Nancy disappeared will ultimately prove? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do that right now, because when the next development breaks in this case, you will want to be here for it.